Under a blazing sun, a humble cowboy saves a royal tribal girl stranded in the desert, risking his own life for hers. As night fades, the valley fills with the sound of hooves. Hundreds of warriors have arrived, surrounding his land. At the forefront, the chief rides with authority and awe, declaring a decision so monumental that it reshapes destiny itself and leaves the cowboy and everyone watching completely speechless. The sky over Red Valley was the color of a dying ember red bleeding into bruised gray. The wind came low and heavy, dragging the scent of rain and iron across the land. Somewhere between thunder and silence the valley waited, and so did Illy Carter. He stood by his corral, hat low, boots half, buried in the dust, staring into a storm that looked more alive than any man. The clouds rolled like beasts above the mesas, their bellies lit with veins of lightning. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of storm that tears open more than the sky. His horses were restless, snorting against the wind. The old mare pawed at the ground, her ears pinned back toward the horizon. Illy followed her gaze and saw something, a shape fighting against the rain, stumbling through the dark. At first, he thought it was a trick of lightning. But then it moved again, small, fragile, human. He dropped his reins and started walking. The storm swallowed his footsteps, mud grabbing at his boots, thunder cracking above like the wrath of something divine. When he reached the fence line, he saw her, a girl collapsed beside a lifeless horse. The animal's eyes were glassed with death, its flanks streaked with foam and blood. She wasn't from around here. That was clear as the sky was wild. Her garments shimmered even through the rain, silk and silver threads, torn and soaked but unmistakably royal. He knelt beside her, rough hands trembling as he brushed the mud from her face. Her skin was warm, too warm. Fevered, lips cracked from thirst. A necklace of carved bone and turquoise hung around her neck, the kind he'd only seen once long ago, on a chief's daughter passing through town, guarded by warriors who would have killed a man for staring too long. Illy looked over his shoulder. The land was empty, save for the storm and the dead horse. No riders, no tracks, just her, Lord above. He muttered under the rain, "What kind of trouble are you?" He lifted her into his arms, light as she was. The wind howled harder, as if warning him to leave her where she fell. But he didn't. He couldn't. Some old part of him, buried under years of dust and sorrow, wouldn't let him. He carried her toward the house, the storm tearing at his coat, lightning cracking across the black sky. The door slammed behind him, cutting off the roar of thunder. Inside, the room was dark, but for the flicker of a dying lamp. He laid her on the cot near the fire, stripped the wet blanket from her shoulders, and covered her with one of his own. Her pulse fluttered weak beneath his touch. He turned to stoke the fire, throwing another log into the orange glow. Outside, the wind clawed at the windows, whispering through the boards like a spirit searching for a way in. He knew the sound. He'd heard it before the night his brother died, when their ranch burned and the tribe came down from the hills. He poured water into a tin cup, his hands shaking. "Don't you die on me now," he murmured. "Not in my house." The girl's eyelids flickered, but she didn't wake. He noticed then a small emblem stitched on her sleeve, gold thread forming a sunburst with feathers around it. His stomach dropped. He'd seen that mark on flags carried into battle. It belonged to the royal house of the Red Mesa tribe. He leaned back, breath heavy in the thick heat of the fire. The rain hammered harder on the roof, the thunder rolling closer. Out there in the storm, the valley watched silent, ancient, and alive. Illy Carter had crossed a line tonight, not just between right and wrong, but between two worlds that had bled each other dry. And somewhere in the distance, through the scream of wind, he thought he heard something else, a horn's faint echo, carried on the storm, warning him that mercy, once chosen, cannot be undone. The storm raged deep into the night, tearing at the rafters as though it wanted to drag the house into the dark. Illy sat by the fire, hat on his knee, watching the girl breathe. Each shallow rise of her chest was a fragile argument against death. The flicker of the flames painted her face in gold and shadow, and he could see streaks of blood where the rain had washed over her skin. He reached for the basin, dipped a rag in warm water, and wiped the dirt from her brow. She stirred, just barely. a sound escaping her throat that wasn't English nor anything he'd heard before. Her hand twitched, reaching out into the air as if calling for someone lost in the storm. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe here." Safe. The word tasted strange on his tongue. Nothing in Red Valley was ever truly safe. Not since the raid. Not since the night the sky burned and his brother's voice vanished into the smoke. He looked at her again, and for a moment he wasn't in the cabin at all. He was back there, fields on fire, bullets cracking through the dark, and the screams of men who believed hate was a kind of salvation. He had learned that mercy had a price, and that the world had a way of collecting it. The wind shifted outside. The horses in the corral kicked against the fence, uneasy. He rose, pulled back the curtain, and peered through the rain. Streaked glass. Nothing but black hills and lightning, but the feeling in his gut didn't lie. Something out there was moving, watching. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. The rain hit him like cold knives, soaking him to the bone in seconds. The lantern flame flickered, nearly died. He scanned the ridges. Nothing but shadows and the far-off growl of thunder. Still, he kept the rifle ready. Old habits never forgot their reasons. A flash of lightning split the sky, and in that heartbeat of white light he saw it. A distant shape on the rise, gone as soon as it appeared. Could have been a man, could have been the storm playing tricks. But Lee Carter knew the look of eyes that watched from cover. He stood there a long while, rain pooling at his boots, before turning back inside. The girl was awake this time, barely. Her eyes opened, dark, wide, full of pain and something deeper, something regal. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "Water," he said, moving quick. He held the cup to her lips. She drank, trembling. Then, in a voice rough from thirst, she spoke a word that chilled him more than the rain ever could. "Warriors." The sound was faint, but the fear behind it was sharp as glass. She tried to sit up, panic flashing in her eyes, but he held her steady. "Rest." He told her, "Ain't no one gonna hurt you here," but he didn't believe it, not fully. When she drifted back into sleep, he sat again by the fire, staring into the flames until they blurred. He thought of what she'd said, warriors, and that mark on her sleeve, the royal sunburst. If she was who he suspected, then her being here meant one thing. Someone out there would come looking. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, swallowed it without a word. The taste burned his throat, but did nothing to quiet the storm building in his chest. Outside, the wind began to shift. The storm wasn't dying. It was moving east, slow and deliberate, as if making room for something worse. By midnight, the rain had turned to a soft drizzle. The thunder had wandered off toward the hills, but in the distance, where the valley met the mountains, faint glows flicker, orange and scattered, like campfires in the dark. Illy set his cup down, jaw tightening. He knew what that meant. Riders, scouts maybe, or a hunting party. He checked his rifle again, then looked back at the girl. She slept with one hand still clutching that turquoise necklace, her face pale against the firelight. He sighed, sat back down, and whispered to himself, "You had to pick my land, didn't you?" The wind eased for a moment, long enough for him to hear the drip of rain from the roof. Then, from somewhere far off, came a sound he hadn't heard in years, a low, mournful horn carried by the valley air. It wasn't thunder now, it wasn't the storm, it was the kind of sound that meant men were on the move. Illy Carter stared into the darkness, and his hand closed tight around the rifle stock. Mercy had found him again. And it never came alone. That morning, the sun crawled over the hills like an old outlaw waking from a sleepless night. The valley smelled of dust and dew, a strange peace hanging in the air after the chaos that had stormed through. The rancher stood by the fence line, hat low, eyes heavy with the weight of yesterday. He thought the trouble was over, but fate out here never closes a chapter that easy. From the ridge, the sound of distant drums rolled like thunder. Slow, measured, ancient, it wasn't the kind of music you hear from men who come in peace. His horse trembled beneath him, ears flicking toward the horizon. Then he saw them, a line of riders, dark silhouettes against the morning blaze, moving like ghosts returning to claim what was theirs. He reached for the rifle resting by the gate, but something inside him said wait. He'd already saved one life yesterday, that of the royal tribal girl whose blood carried the pride of a nation. Maybe this was the price for that mercy. The riders stopped at the far end of the field. At their head was a man wearing an eagle feather crown, his face carved by wind and time. He didn't shout, didn't raise a weapon, just stared. A stare so sharp it could slice through a man's resolve. The rancher took off his hat, nodded once, a silent greeting between two worlds that never mixed right. The chief's hand moved slowly toward his heart, and then to the sky. The drums stopped, the valley fell still. In that silence, the rancher knew this was no visit. It was judgment. The wind carried the smell of sage and firewood as the riders dismounted, forming a wide circle across the rancher's land. Not a word was spoken, but their silence said more than any threat could. It was the silence of warriors who had buried too many sons, the silence of justice riding on ancient law. The rancher stood his ground, heart thudding slow and heavy. He'd faced storms, droughts, and men twice his size with knives in their boots, but this was different. This was history walking toward him. The chief stepped forward, cloak fluttering like a hawk's wing. His voice came deep and measured, carved in the rhythm of old tongues. "You helped the royal daughter of our blood," he said, eyes burning through the dust between them. "But do you know what that means, white man?" The rancher didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt a storm before it finished roaring. "She is bound by our law," the chief continued. "Saved life owes life, and the one who saves must answer to the tribe." For a heartbeat, the rancher thought they'd come to take her back or take him down. But then, out of the circle, she appeared. The royal tribal girl, the same one he'd carried out of the dirt and danger, now standing tall in garments woven with the colors of her people. Her gaze found his, calm but filled with unspoken war. "The valley has chosen its path," she whispered, stepping closer, "and you, rancher, are now part of it." The drums began again, slow, distant, echoing through the mountains. And with each beat, the rancher realized his act of kindness had tied his fate to a world that didn't forgive easily and never forgot. That night, the valley didn't sleep. Coyotes howled like the ghosts of forgotten wars, and the stars burned cold above a land split between two destinies. The rancher sat by his porch fire, a cup of black coffee trembling in his calloused hands, the echo of those drums still pounding in his head. He couldn't shake her words, "You're part of it now." They lingered like a brand on his soul. From the shadows of the barn, his horse shifted uneasily. Animals always felt the change before men did. The air was heavier, charged with something he couldn't name, part fear, part promise. Then he saw her again. The royal tribal girl stepped out of the dark, wrapped in a cloak the color of riverstone. Her face was calm, but her eyes were torn between gratitude and sorrow. "I had to come," she said softly, voice barely louder than the fire crackle. "My father believes you must stand before the council. He says no debt can rest unsettled under the sky." The rancher nodded, quiet. "If there's a reckoning, I'll face it. I've never run from what's due." Her gaze softened. "You don't understand. This isn't about punishment, it's about fate. You changed the path meant for me, and now theirs has changed too." He looked out toward the mountains where the tribe's campfire lights flickered faint and far. "Then I'll ride with you come dawn," he said, steady as the wind. The girl lowered her eyes. "Once you do, there's no turning back." The fire cracked, the night deepened, and somewhere in that silence, the rancher knew dawn wasn't bringing peace. It was bringing a trial written long before he was born. Dawn broke slow and blood, orange, spilling light across the valley like a warning. The rancher saddled his horse in silence, each buckle and strap feeling heavier than the last. The royal tribal girl rode beside him, her face half veiled, her silence speaking the language of sorrow. They followed the narrow trail that twisted between boulders and dry riverbeds, the kind of road only spirits remembered. As they climbed higher, the drums began again, distant but deliberate, as if calling them toward their judgment. When they reached the plateau, the tribe stood waiting. Dozens of riders lined the ridge, motionless as stone. At the center stood the chief, his eagle, feather crown glinting in the sun, eyes sharp and knowing. The girl dismounted first and stepped forward. "He saved my life," she said, her voice trembling. "Without him, I would be lost to the dust." His hands carried no harm. The chief's gaze didn't waver. "A life saved is never a simple thing," he answered. "It binds the spirit of the Savior to the one he saved. Our law demands balance." The rancher dismounted slowly, his boots crunching the earth. "Then tell me how to balance it," he said, steady and low. "If I owe something, I'll pay it." The chief studied him for a long moment, the wind whispering through feathers and grass. Then, with a voice that carried like thunder across the plains, he spoke. "You will not pay with gold. You will pay with your name." A murmur rippled through the warriors. The girl turned sharply toward her father. "No, you can't." The chief raised his hand. "He will live among us until the spirits say his debt is done. Until then, the valley is no longer his." The rancher looked out across the land he'd built with his own hands. The wind carried the smell of sage and smoke the scent of endings. He said nothing, only nodded once, as a man does when fate finally comes calling. And as the drums thundered, the valley took a new name, one that would forever remember the day a rancher lost his own. The days that followed passed like slow-moving shadows. The rancher's land, once his pride, once his world, now lay under the watch of tribal guards. He didn't fight it. He didn't curse the skies. He just worked, silent and steady, like a man repaying a debt he never meant to owe. The royal girl watched him from afar. She saw how he moved, not as a prisoner, but as a man who understood the weight of honor. He fixed fences that weren't his, fetched water for strangers, and helped mend the tribe's corrals when storms tore through. Some of the warriors began to nod at him in quiet respect. Others, still burning with suspicion, looked at him like a wolf circling their fire. At night, he sat alone by the river, listening to the whisper of reeds and the low hum of tribal songs. He missed the sound of his cattle, the laughter that once filled his porch, the easy silence of being his own man. But more than that, he wondered about the girl, the one whose life had rewritten his own. One evening she came to him. The sky was painted red, and the first stars blinked awake. "My father watches you," she said softly. "He says your spirit doesn't break, even when bound." The rancher looked at her, his voice low. "A man doesn't break for doing what's right. He just learns what it costs." Her eyes shimmered in the fading light. "You've already paid more than most." He shook his head. "No, not yet. Not till your father says my name's mine again." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with words neither dared to say. Then she whispered, "Maybe it isn't his to give back any more." The night deepened around them, and for the first time the rancher realized his punishment had turned into something else entirely. Something he couldn't name but couldn't walk away from either. The moon climbed high that night, silvering the valley in quiet sorrow. The tribe slept in scattered tents, fires dimmed to glowing embers. Only the rancher stayed awake, leaning against a fence post that wasn't his, staring toward the mountains as if they might give him back what he'd lost. He thought about freedom, how it wasn't always about open land or unbroken sky. Sometimes it was about peace inside a man, and how that peace could be taken even when his hands weren't tied. Footsteps rustled softly behind him. The royal tribal girl approached, her cloak brushing the dust, her face calm yet shadowed by thought. "You don't sleep," she said quietly. He gave a small nod. "Never could when my life feels borrowed." She looked toward the dark horizon. "My father's law binds you, but his heart doesn't hate you. He sees what you are, a man who gave without asking." The rancher's voice dropped low. "Then why keep me here?" "Because," she whispered, "sometimes a tribe doesn't just need justice, it needs change. You came like a storm, and storms never leave things the way they were." Her words settled over him like dust in the wind. Then she reached out, placing a hand over his calloused palm. "Maybe the valley isn't taking your name," she said. "Maybe it's giving you a new one." The air went still, no drum, no wind, no sound but her breath and the distant cry of a coyote. For a long moment neither spoke again. They stood between two worlds, one born of dust and cattle, the other of drums and destiny. And though neither would admit it, something in the silence had already chosen for them. By dawn, the rancher knew his old life was gone, but in its place, something wild and uncertain had begun to grow, something that might one day set both their worlds on fire. Morning broke cold and golden across the valley. The rancher rose before the sun, as he always did, his hands finding work before his mind found peace. The tribe had begun to trust him with more: the horses, the herds, even the children who ran laughing through the fields he once called his own. But not everyone was at ease with his presence. Some of the younger warriors still saw him as a trespasser wearing borrowed honor. Their stares followed him like rifle sights, quiet but sharp. That morning, while tending the horses by the river, he felt that tension draw close. Hooves stirred dust, and 3 riders approached men of the tribe, proud, unblinking, their hands resting near the hilts of their blades. One of them, broad as a mountain and fierce in his stare, spoke first. "You wear our trust too easily, outsider. You walk our camp as if you belong." The rancher straightened, slow and steady. "I walk where your chief allows me," he said calmly. "I earn my stay with sweat, not pride." The man spat into the dust. "A debt paid in sweat don't make you one of us." Before the rancher could speak, the royal tribal girl appeared on the ridge above. Her voice carried like wind through canyon walls. "Enough, Kiona. My father gave his word the rancher stays under our protection." Kiona's jaw clenched, but his eyes burned with something deeper than anger, jealousy. He looked between her and the rancher, saw the quiet understanding that passed between them, and his pride twisted into rage. "Then let him prove it," he growled. "Let him ride with us tomorrow through the Red Gorge." A murmur rippled through the other warriors. The Red Gorge, a place no stranger ever returned from. The rancher didn't flinch. "If that's the law of your land," he said, meeting Kiona's gaze, "then I'll ride." The royal girl's eyes widened in quiet fear, but the rancher only turned toward the setting sun, a man who'd rather face danger than doubt. For him, the trial wasn't about surviving the gorge. It was about proving that his place among them was earned or buried trying. Night settled like a cloak of iron over the valley. Fires burned low in the tribal camp, their glow licking at the hides of sleeping horses and the faces of men who pretended not to dream. The air was thick with silence, the kind that comes before a test of blood. The rancher sat alone beside the dying fire, the embers reflecting in his eyes like memories he couldn't bury. He'd been through many trials: drought, loss, the ache of living, but never one that demanded he earn a place in another man's world. His hat lay beside him, rim charred from years of storms, sweat darkening the band. He turned it in his hands as if it were a compass trying to find north in a land that wasn't his. Across the camp, the royal girl watched him. Her name, Liana, whispered through the tents like a prayer no one dared speak. She approached quietly, a shawl draped over her shoulders, silver embroidery catching the moonlight. "You shouldn't ride tomorrow," she said softly. "Kiona means to shame you or kill you." He looked up, the firelight sketching lines of exhaustion on his face. "Maybe he will," he said, "but a man can't live forever owing others his place." She stepped closer, the weight of her lineage heavy between them. "You've already proven your worth. My father sees it. I see it." He shook his head, slow and certain. "Worth seen ain't the same as worth earned. If I walk away from this, I'll be just another story told in pity." The wind caught the edge of her shawl, carrying the scent of rain and cedar. For a moment, her voice trembled. "And if you don't come back?" He smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon that lay hidden in darkness. "Then maybe I'll finally find peace with all I've lost." She wanted to speak again, to plead, but words felt too fragile for what lingered between them. Instead, she placed a carved token in his hand, a small eagle of bone, wings spread in flight. "For luck," she whispered. "My father gave it to me when I was a child. He said the eagle flies only for those who walk without fear." He closed his fingers around it, nodding once. "Then I'll keep it close." When dawn broke, the camp stirred. Warriors gathered at the edge of the valley, their faces painted in crimson clay, their eyes cold with tradition. The red gorge waited a cut through the earth where sunlight rarely touched. The rancher mounted his horse, the token tied to his wrist with a strip of leather. The royal girl stood among the crowd, her gaze steady, though her heart pounded like distant thunder. Kiona rode beside him, smirking. "Let's see how deep your courage runs, white man." The rancher's voice came quiet, almost a prayer. "Courage don't run, it stands." And with that, the riders spurred forward, hooves pounding against stone, dust rising like ghosts in the morning light. As they vanished into the jaws of the gorge, the valley fell silent again, save for the whisper of wind through the sagebrush, carrying one truth the land already knew, that some men ride not to prove themselves to others, but to find out if the fire inside them still burns at all. The Red Gorge was no place for the living. Its walls rose steep and scarred, painted by centuries of blood and echo. Sunlight barely touched its depths, and when it did, it came down in thin, trembling shafts like heaven peering in shame at what men did below. The rancher rode in silence, the eagle token brushing against his wrist with every step of his horse. Behind him, dust rolled in slow waves. Ahead, the gorge wound deeper, the air thick with the scent of iron and sage. Kiona led the way, his back straight, his posture proud, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the dark. The other warriors followed at a distance, their faces unreadable. This was not a hunt, nor a ride of honor. It was a test, and every man there knew what the gorge demanded. The sound of hooves against stone echoed like gunfire. The rancher's breath came slow, steady, his mind fixed on every shadow that moved between the rocks. There were stories of men swallowed by this place, of whispers that led riders astray. Some said the gorge had a spirit that measured a man's heart by the weight of his fear. After an hour's ride, Kiona halted. He turned, the light catching the edge of his blade as he pointed toward a cluster of boulders. "This is where your test begins," he said. "There's a ridge beyond those rocks. A mountain cat took one of our scouts 2 moons ago. Bring back its pelt, and you'll have our respect." The rancher's brow tightened, and if I fail, Kiona's mouth curved in a cold half-smile. Then the gorge keeps what it's owed. No man spoke. The wind moaned through the cracks in the cliffs like a warning. The rancher dismounted, tying his reins to a crooked branch jutting from the rock. He checked his rifle, thumb brushing the smooth wood as if greeting an old friend. Then, without another word, he walked into the shadows. The gorge swallowed him whole. Inside, the air was colder, the light gone to ash. His boots sank into loose gravel, every step echoing back like another man was walking beside him. Somewhere above, a hawk cried sharp and distant. He paused beside a fallen tree, eyes scanning the ridges. Tracks. Fresh, too large for a fox, too narrow for a bear. The cat was close. The silence grew heavier. Even his heartbeat felt loud. He crouched low, finger steady on the trigger, when a sound rippled through the dark, a growl, low and wet, vibrating through the stone. Then another closer. The cat struck from the shadows, a blur of tawny muscle and teeth. The rifle cracked, the sound exploding through the gorge like thunder. The beast twisted midair, slamming into him before falling limp to the earth. Dust rose in slow spirals. The rancher lay still, chest heaving, the cat's breath dying against his boot. For a long moment he just stared at the creature, at the blood glinting under the faint light, at the proof of what he'd come to do. Then he heard another sound, faint but human, a whisper of footsteps, a click of metal. He turned sharply, rifle raised. From behind the rocks, Kiona emerged, his face shadowed, his pistol drawn and aimed at the rancher's chest. "So," Kiona said quietly, eyes cold as the stones around them, "you did it. Pity it won't matter." And before the rancher could answer, Kiona pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the gorge, echoing far beyond the canyon walls, reaching even the valley where the royal girl waited, her heart suddenly tightening. though she didn't yet know why. The gunshot rolled through the gorge like a storm trapped between cliffs. Ravens burst from the rocks, wings slicing through the silence. The rancher staggered back, pain flashing white across his chest. He dropped to one knee, the world narrowing to dust and thunder. Smoke curled from Kiona's pistol. His lips twisted into a smirk. "Did you really think you'd walk out of here?" The rancher pressed a hand to his side, blood, dark and warm, seeping through his shirt. But his eyes didn't falter. They burned with something deeper than pain. "I thought a man's words still meant something," he rasped. Kiona stepped closer, boots crunching over stone. "Your kind's words mean nothing. You saved our princess, yes, but you poisoned her with your presence. She's forgotten what loyalty means." The rancher looked up, the ghost of a grin cutting through the blood. "You ain't talking about loyalty, Kiona. You're talking about jealousy." The warrior's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then the rage took him, wild, sharp, blinding. He lifted his gun again, ready to finish what pride had started. But before the shot came, a sound split the air, the high cry of an eagle. It circled above, a streak of gold and shadow, its voice echoing across the cliffs. Kiona's hand hesitated just long enough. The rancher moved fast, desperate, fueled by instinct older than fear. He lunged, grappling for the weapon. The two men crashed against the rocks, dust flying, fists meeting flesh. The pistol clattered away, lost among the stones. They fought like animals, no words, no honor, just survival. Kiona's blade flashed, the rancher caught his wrist, twisted, and the knife tumbled from his grip. But Kiona was stronger, fueled by fury. He slammed the rancher against the wall, his hand tightening around his throat. "Stay down, white man," he hissed. The rancher's eyes met his, calm even in the choke of death. "Not my way." With a surge of strength, he drove his knee upward, broke the hold, and swung the rifle's butt across Kiona's face. The warrior fell back, blood trailing down his cheek, breath heaving. Both men froze, panting, bleeding, the gorge spinning around them. Then the sound came, a rumble, low at first, then growing. The rocks trembled. Pebbles danced at their feet. The rifle shot had awakened the gorge, loosened stones high above. Kiona looked up in horror. No. The cliff gave way. A landslide roared down, stone and dust crashing like thunder. The rancher dove aside as Kiona disappeared beneath a cascade of falling rock. When the dust settled, only silence remained, heavy, final. The rancher lay still for a long time, the echo of the fall fading into memory. His chest burned with pain, his vision blurred, but he was alive. Slowly he rose, leaning on his rifle. He looked at the pile of stone that buried Kiona. For a moment, sorrow flickered across his face, not victory, not relief, just the quiet mourning of a man who'd seen too much death. He whispered a prayer not for himself, but for the one who'd fallen to his own pride. Then he cut a strip from his shirt, pressed it to his wound, and turned back toward the valley. Each step was heavy, dragging, marked by blood. But ahead, through the haze, he could see the faintest shimmer of sunlight, the mouth of the gorge, the edge of survival. And somewhere beyond that light, Liana waited, unaware that the man who had fought for her had faced both betrayal and death, and kept walking. As the valley opened before him, the rancher lifted his eyes to the horizon. The wind carried the cry of the eagle once more, soaring high and free. He looked down at the bone token still tied to his wrist, and a faint, broken smile crossed his face. Guess the bird was right. He whispered, "Fear don't fly," and with that, he walked into the dawn, wounded, weary, but alive, a man reborn from the dust and judgment of the Red Gorge. That night, the valley didn't sleep. The fire crackled like it knew something the men didn't. Horses shuffled nervously, feeling the tension in the air long before any human did. Illy sat on the porch, hat low over his brow, the glow of his pipe dimming and brightening like a dying star. He wasn't smoking for comfort anymore, he was smoking to think. Because from the ridge above he had seen it, a faint flicker of torches, too many to be travelers, too organized to be lost hunters. They were coming, hundreds of them. The royal tribes from the south had begun their march not with banners or drums, but with silence that carried more threat than 1,000 war cries. Inside the cabin, Ayanna moved quietly, packing what little food they had, while Lyra, the royal girl he'd saved, sat by the window, eyes hollow with guilt. She had heard the same rumor whispered by a scout before they left the mountain pass. The king has sent the desert clans. He wants his daughter back. And the man who defied him. Illy spoke without turning around. Don't you dare blame yourself, girl. You didn't ask for this, but she did. Not with words, with her heart. Every moment she'd spent by his side had written her defiance in the sand for the whole kingdom to see. Outside, thunder rolled. The valley seemed smaller now, its walls closing in, the air heavy with the scent of rain and danger. Illy rose to his feet, his boots creaking against the old boards. Lyra. He said softly, if they come by night, we'll take the northern ridge. You'll ride out with Ayanna. She looked at him, trembling. And you, he paused. The pipe in his hand went still. I'll buy you enough time to reach the river. Pause, low music swell. It wasn't heroism he spoke with. It was duty. That kind of duty only men of dust and regret carry, the kind that makes you stand your ground, even when you know you're outnumbered. Ayanna stepped out, placing her hand on Illy's shoulder. We'll fight with you. Illy shook his head, eyes like burnt coal. No, you'll live for me. And for a long moment none of them spoke. Only the sound of the wind and the distant roll of hooves breaking through the silence. The storm wasn't coming anymore, it was already here. When the first drop of rain hit the dust, Illy knew the night had chosen its side. The storm wasn't here to bless the land, it had come to cover the screams. The torches on the southern ridge began to move, dozens at first, then hundreds, a river of light descending into his quiet valley. Illy took one last look at the cabin, at the small flicker of firelight inside, and then tightened his belt, checked the rounds in his rifle, and whispered under his breath, let's give them a story they'll remember. The rain began to fall harder. Each droplet hissed on the barrel of his gun. Steam rising like the valley itself was breathing out a warning. Behind him, Ayanna appeared in the doorway, holding Lyra's hand. Illy, she said, her voice trembling, they're coming from both sides. He nodded slowly, like he already knew. Then we hold the middle. Sound, thunder, cracks, echo of distant war drums. The first arrow hissed through the rain, embedding itself in the porch beam beside his face. Then came the second, and then the night erupted. War cries tore through the storm. Men rushed down the slopes, feet pounding against the soaked ground, blades flashing in the lightning's glow. Illy fired once. A clean shot, one man fell. Another came. He fired again and again, but there were too many shadows for one man's courage to stop. Ayanna grabbed the spare rifle and took her place by the window, firing through the cracks as the cabin shook with the echo of battle. Lyra stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of love and guilt. Go, Illy shouted, now while they're held back, but she didn't move. Not until the door splintered open and the first raider burst through. Illy swung his rifle like a club, sending the man sprawling, then grabbed Lyra by the arm and pushed her toward the back door. Run, the rain turned red. Flames spread from the oil lamp that had fallen in the fight, licking up the cabin walls. Smoke and thunder blended together, swallowing their screams. Outside, Ayanna had mounted a horse, pulling Lyra up beside her. Illy, she cried through the rain. He looked back once through smoke and chaos, and for a heartbeat, the world stood still. He smiled, a quiet, broken smile that said everything he didn't have time to speak. Go, don't look back. And then he turned toward the advancing line, the king's warriors now close enough that he could see the reflection of his fire in their eyes. He fired his last shot, and as lightning tore the sky open, Illy's silhouette disappeared into the blaze. Music fades, soft, mournful strings by dawn. The valley was quiet again. Only the ashes remembered his name. The storm hadn't stopped. It roared over the valley like a beast too angry to die, tearing at the trees, washing away the footprints of every soul it claimed. Ayanna rode hard, her arms locked around Lyra, guiding the trembling horse through the flooded plains. Behind them, the valley burned a long, red scar beneath the black sky. Neither woman spoke. The rain filled their throats, the thunder drowned their thoughts, but both carried the same fire inside, the kind that grief can't drown and fate can't tame. Lyra's voice broke first. Why didn't he come with us? Ayanna didn't answer right away. Her jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the northern ridge ahead. When she finally spoke, her words were low, ragged. Because some men are meant to build peace with their hands, and others with their sacrifice. Lyra buried her face against her shoulder. He didn't deserve to die for us. No, Ayanna whispered. He deserved to live for what he believed in. But the world, it doesn't always trade fair. Sound thunder fades, replaced by dripping rain, soft hoofsteps over soaked grass. As they reached higher ground, the storm began to ease. The wind softened to a mournful hum. They stopped beneath an old pine, its branches heavy with rain, and dismounted. The horse stood trembling, steam rising from its back. Ayanna stroked its neck, whispering words in her tribal tongue, words that meant endure, little one. Lyra stood in silence, staring toward the burning valley. Through the haze, she could still see the faint flicker of orange, the place where Illy had stood his ground. Her lips trembled. He said not to look back. Ayanna turned to her, rain dripping from her lashes. Then don't look forward, because if the storm spared us, it's for a reason. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small pouch. Illy's. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was his father's silver coin. The same one he used to flip at sundown before every hard day. Ayanna pressed it into Lyra's palm. Keep this. When the time comes, you'll know what it means. Lyra clenched it tight, the metal warm against her skin despite the cold. And in that moment, under the bruised sky and falling rain, something changed in her, something fierce and unbreakable. The storm had taken her heart, but it had left her his courage. Music's soft instrumental swell, like dawn pushing through clouds, and so, with the valley behind them and the unknown ahead, the two women turned toward the ridge where destiny and a buried truth waited to rise with the morning sun. By morning, the rain had quieted to a whisper. The land still smoked, charred, broken, but somehow breathing again. And through the thinning fog, two riders moved like ghosts, carrying the memory of a man the world would soon forget. Ayanna led the horse through a narrow pass lined with ancient stones, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. Every shadow made her hand drift toward the knife at her waist. Beside her, Lyra rode silent, Illy's silver coin clutched in her palm like it could still guide them through the dark. Neither spoke for miles. It wasn't silence born of fear, it was reverence. Every gust of wind that brushed their faces felt like a whisper from the valley below. Finally, when they reached the ridge's crest, Ayanna stopped and turned her gaze south. Below them stretched the scarred plain where the ranch once stood. Smoke still curled upward, soft, gray ribbons against the pale sky. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in her mother tongue, one the winds carried back down into the ashes. Lyra dismounted, her boots sinking into the wet soil. Do you think he's really gone? Ayanna didn't answer at first. She walked to the edge and picked up a piece of charred wood, the remnant of a fence post. Illy's fence, she turned it in her hands, blackened and fragile. Then she said quietly, men like him don't die, Lyra. They stay in the ground they fought for, and in the hearts they changed. Sound distant hawk cry, wind rising slightly. Lyra knelt, placing the silver coin in the dirt before her. She pressed it deep into the soil with trembling fingers. This land will remember him, she said. Even if the world doesn't. Ayanna nodded. Then let it be his grave and his glory. They stood there a long while, two souls bound by loss, staring over a land that had taken everything from them yet somehow given them purpose. Then, from behind the ridge, the sun began to rise slow and golden, painting the valley in soft light, and for the first time since the fire, the world looked alive again. Lyra wiped her tears, straightened her back, and turned to Ayanna. "What do we do now?" Ayanna looked east, where the trails led to unknown lands and new dangers. "We ride," she said, "for him, for peace, and for the promise he left behind." Sound horse hooves starting slowly, then building rhythm as music swells as they rode away. The wind swept through the valley carrying the last echo of Illy's voice, faint but eternal, "Protect what's good, even when it costs you everything." And just like that, the valley fell silent again. But its silence wasn't empty, it was sacred, it was his. Weeks had passed since the fire. Red Valley no longer screamed with war, but it whispered with memory. The fences were rebuilt, crude but standing. The barn had been patched with rough, hewn timber, and the scent of smoke still lingered in the corners of the ranch house. Illy walked slowly through the fields, hands brushing the tall grass. Every step felt heavy with remembrance, the battles fought, the lives lost, the courage spent. His eyes swept over the valley, catching on small signs of life. A bird perched on a fence post, a rabbit darting across the open plain, the soft ripple of the creek catching the sun. It was quiet, too quiet in a way that made the heart ache. Then in the distance a line of riders appeared, moving deliberately, carefully, not raiders, not soldiers, tribal craftsmen, artisans, and elders, their hands full of timber, tools, and clay. Among them rode Lyra. Her face bore the same grace, but her eyes shone differently, not with fear, not with guilt, but with purpose. Illy's breath caught in his chest. For a long moment neither moved. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the wind pausing, the crows circling silently above. When they reached the ranch, Lyra dismounted gracefully. She approached Illy, the tribal craftsman spreading out behind her to repair and rebuild. "Your home survived," she said softly. Her voice carried the weight of the mountains behind her, but it needed our hands to remind it that life returns after fire. Illy nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Thank you, all of you." She looked at him for a long moment. No words could capture the bond forged in blood and mercy, in courage and grief. Finally, she extended her hand, not in farewell, not in promise, but in acknowledgement. And in that handshake, silent and firm, Illy felt a shift. The valley was still wounded, yet it was alive. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life that might be free of shadows. Sound hammering and sawing in the background, water trickling in the creek, wind brushing through the repaired fences. He walked among the craftsmen, helping where he could, letting the work fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. Each nail hammered, each board placed, each wall rebuilt felt like a step toward healing, not just for the ranch, but for him, for the valley, and for the lives that had crossed in blood and fire. Above them, the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky crimson and gold. The crows circled lazily, their cries softer now, almost mournful. And as Illy stood there, watching the light touch every corner of the valley, he felt it. Peace wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant, it didn't roar. Peace was quiet, steady, enduring. As night draped its velvet cloak over Red Valley, the ranch glowed softly with lantern light. Inside, Illy moved among the craftsmen, sharing quiet smiles and nods, lending hands where it was needed. His body ached in places he hadn't felt since the fire, but the work was a balm, each repaired beam and mended fence a stitch in the torn fabric of his life. Outside, Lyra walked among the repaired fields, speaking quietly with the tribal artisans. She laughed lightly, a sound fragile but unbroken, and the valley seemed to exhale with her. Her presence was no longer a burden, it was a promise that the wounds of yesterday could yield life today. When the work slowed, she approached Illy once more. "Red Valley has a new rhythm now," she said, eyes glinting in the lantern light, "and you have a chance to walk in it." He shook his head, letting a slow smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "I've walked this valley alone for too long, feared it, cursed it, fought it. Maybe it's time I learned to live with it instead." She nodded, understanding what he meant without words. There was a silence between them, not heavy, but full of shared memories, grief, courage, and a bond that neither fire nor blood could sever. "Will you stay?" she asked softly, not as a command, not as a plea, but as a question that mattered to both of them. Illy looked around at the valley, at the repaired fences, the barn standing proud again, the craftsmen smiling softly as they worked under the lantern glow. He breathed deeply, the cool night air filling his lungs, and for the first time in years he felt light. "I'll stay," he said finally, "and I'll protect it. As long as it needs me." Sound gentle night wind, river murmuring, soft hoofbeats fading as the last craftsmen depart. The two of them stood together outside the cabin, watching the crows circle above, the stars glimmering in the clear sky. No words were necessary. The valley itself spoke of survival, of forgiveness, of the quiet power of mercy. And in that silence, Illy finally smiled, not a smile weighed by regret, not a smile forced by survival, but a smile born from the knowledge that life could still be stitched back together. The night deepened, and the valley settled. The ghosts of the past lingered, yes, but they no longer ruled. The wind brushed through the grass, carrying the soft laughter of two women and a man who had learned that courage wasn't only in battle, it was in mercy, in forgiveness, in the quiet acts that rebuilt both land and heart. Music soft, uplifting strings swell, fading slowly into night, and as the lanterns dimmed one by one, Red Valley lay at peace once more, holding within it a bond that no storm could ever undo. The valley woke slowly, bathed in the gentle glow of dawn. The fire of the past weeks had long since cooled, leaving only the scent of sun, warmed earth, and new beginnings. Illy walked along the edge of the fields, the early light casting long shadows across the grass. Each step was measured, deliberate, the weight of history pressing lightly on his shoulders, but no longer crushing him. He had faced the storm, the fire, the wrath of hundreds, and he had lived. Not just survived, he had endured. From the distance, the sound of hooves echoed. Lyra and Ayana rode toward him, the morning sun catching in their hair and on the metal of their saddles. Their approach was quiet, dignified, and full of purpose, a reflection of the peace now threading through the valley. Illy lifted his hat, letting the sun warm his face. For a moment, the valley seemed to hold its breath, the wind soft, the grass swaying gently as if acknowledging the calm that had returned. Lyra dismounted first. She approached with the silver coin still clasped in her hand, the token of courage and memory. "I came to make sure the valley remembers," she said softly, voice carrying the weight of years and storms survived. Illy nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon where mountains met sky. "Memory is all we have," he replied, "and sometimes it's the only thing that keeps the world from forgetting what courage and mercy look like." Ayana joined them, her presence steady and grounding. Together, the three of them walked along the ridge, overlooking the valley that had been both battlefield and sanctuary. They didn't need words. The land spoke for them, each fence repaired, each field sown, every tree planted in remembrance of what had been lost and what had been saved. Sound soft breeze, birds singing, a distant creek flowing steadily. Illy knelt for a moment, pressing a hand to the earth. The soil was rich, soaked by rain, and warm beneath his fingers. It held the stories of blood and fire, yes, but also of mercy, courage, and resilience. He rose, eyes meeting Lyra's. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly, "and I did what I could. Now the rest belongs to the valley and to those who choose to care for it." The three of them stood there, side by side, watching as the first true rays of the sun cut across Red Valley. A horizon stretched endless before them, golden, vast, and full of promise. In that moment, Illy realized something profound. A man's legacy is not measured by the battles he fights, but by the lives he touches and the courage he leaves behind. Music soft, cinematic strings rise, carrying hope and reflection, and as the wind brushed across his face, carrying the scent of grass, rain, and new beginnings, Illy allowed himself to truly hope for the first time in decades. The valley had changed, not just in its walls or fences, not just in the rebuilt cabins or the scattered smoke of morning fires, but in the way it breathed steady, calm, and alive. Illy walked through the fields, hands brushing the tops of the grass, feeling the pulse of the land beneath his fingertips. Every blade seemed to whisper of survival, of courage, of mercy that had defied the darkness. He paused at the edge of the ridge where the land fell away into the valley below. From here, the horizon stretched endless mountains kissed by the sun, rivers winding like silver threads, the sky a canvas of gold and rose. It was beautiful, and it was his. Lyra approached quietly, holding the small pouch Illy had given her his father's coin, now a symbol not of loss, but of remembrance. "I keep it with me always," she said softly. "For what we've learned, for what we've survived." Illy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries storms in its shadow, but warmth in its light. "The coin? It's just metal. The courage is yours, Lyra. You carried it through fire, through fear. You carried it for both of us." Ayanna joined them, her eyes on the valley, steady as the land itself. "We all carried it," she said, "in our own way, and now we leave it here in the valley, in the people, in the memory of what was done right." Illy turned toward them, the wind lifting his hat, tousling his hair. "The world will forget the names, perhaps, but the land remembers, the brave, the merciful. They live in every stone, every tree, every sunrise." The three of them stood there, silhouettes against the rising sun, and for a long moment nothing moved but the wind. The valley, healed and enduring, seemed to bow in quiet acknowledgement. And then Illy spoke, a low, firm voice that carried across the golden fields. "Justice rides not on the fastest horse, nor on the sharpest gun, but on the bravest heart. Let that be remembered." Lyra placed the coin into the earth at the ridge's edge, pressing it down into the soil where it would remain, a silent monument to courage and mercy. Ayanna laid her hand over Lyra's, joining her in the gesture, a bond that spoke louder than any words. The wind rose, sweeping through the valley like a sigh, carrying with it the story of a man who had stood alone against hundreds, who had faced fire and blood and fear, and who had chosen compassion over hate. Illy watched the horizon, eyes steady, heart light. The valley behind him, the world ahead, and the legacy of his courage resting quietly in the land he had fought to protect. Music triumphant yet gentle, strings and wind instruments weaving together, fading slowly into open air, and as the sun climbed higher, illuminating every corner of Red Valley, one truth remained unshaken. A man's honor is not measured by battle alone, but by the mercy he offers, the lives he saves, and the courage he leaves behind. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the story onward, of the cowboy who helped a royal girl, who stood against 100 warriors, and who taught the valley and those who would come after what true bravery truly means.